As transatlantic tensions over Greenland have escalated, European policymakers have started desperately scrambling around to find some leverage over Trump's America. Attention has duly turned towards the trillions of dollars worth of American financial assets owned by Europeans, including a couple $1 trillion worth of US government bonds, and the possibility of a coordinated sell-off, which would spark panic in the US financial markets and probably push the US government into a full-blown debt crisis. This might sound implausibly far-fetched, but the ideas apparently gained enough traction that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent felt the need to say something, telling reporters on Monday that it would defy logic and urging European leaders to take a deep breath. So in this video, we're going to look at whether Europe could actually dump US assets en masse, why the answer is probably no, and why there are still some less extreme ways for Europe to weaponize America's underappreciated dependence on European money. If you love staying informed and want some of the best reporting on YouTube, then subscribe and ring the bell for more. So, to understand this idea, you need a bit of context. In short, Europeans own a lot of American financial assets. According to an analysis of Federal Reserve data by the Financial Times, European NATO members own a grand total of $12.6 trillion worth of US assets, about a third of all foreign holdings. Most of this is in the form of US stocks, because Europeans really like investing in the S&P 500. But Europeans also own about $2.8 trillion worth of US government bonds, or about 10% of the entire market. For context, bonds are financial instruments that governments use to borrow money. They basically say, we'll sell you this bond for a lump of cash up front, and then pay you a little bit of interest every year until the bond matures, at which point we'll pay back the lump of money, otherwise known as the bond's face value. US government bonds are generally known as Treasuries because they're issued by the US Treasury. Importantly, however, the effective annual interest rate, or yield, on a bond can change if markets decide they don't want to pay the face value. For instance, imagine a bond with a face value of $1,000 offering an interest rate of 5%. If the markets suddenly decide they only want to pay $900 instead of $1,000 for that bond now, whoever buys it would effectively be paid a higher yield. After all, $50 is more than 5% of $900. It's more like 5.5%. And after 10 years, this new bondholder would also get an additional $100, because the US would pay back the full $1,000 face value, but this new bondholder only bought the bond for $900. This means the effective yield would actually be over 6%. Anyway, the suggestion here is that Europeans could suddenly sell off all their treasuries en masse. This would massively push down the price of treasuries, thus pushing up the effective yield. This would be terrible news for the US government, given its debt burden already looks pretty unsustainable. America's debt-to-GDP ratio currently sits at about 120% of GDP. It's running an annual deficit of about 6% of GDP, and yields are already elevated by historical standards. The yield on a 10-year treasury, for instance, currently sits at about 4.3%. A sudden increase in yields, which would both make it more expensive to issue new debt and service existing debt, could genuinely push the US into an acute fiscal crisis. So, could this actually happen? Well, while this idea might have an intuitive appeal, there are at least three big problems. First, while precise numbers are hard to come by, most of Europe's US assets are held by the private sector, so it's not really clear how European governments could force private institutions to sell their holdings without an unprecedented intervention. Second, even if European governments could somehow force the private sector's hand, a mass sell-off would probably force Europeans to accept large losses on their US assets, given they'd have to sell at discounts to find enough buyers. And third, while a crisis in the treasury market might screw the US, it would also screw Europe. This is because the American and European economies are deeply interdependent, especially when it comes to finance. This was very apparent in 2008. While the crisis obviously originated in America, European banks were actually more acutely affected, which is why about half of the Federal Reserve's liquidity support actually went to European, not American banks. This speaks to an oft overlooked element of that crisis. The Fed didn't just bail out America, it also sort of bailed out Europe. Anyway, you get the point. A mass sell-off of Treasuries is essentially the financial equivalent of a nuclear strike, bringing with it the promise of mutually assured destruction. Nonetheless, there are other ways for Europe to weaponize its US assets. We see at least 3 less radical options. The first is a managed sell-off of treasuries held by the European public sector, including sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. This could push US borrowing costs up to uncomfortable levels without triggering a full-blown crisis, and allow Europe to exercise leverage steadily during any negotiations. The second is some sort of regulatory fiddle to make treasuries less attractive to the private sector. We don't want to get too nerdy here, but the most obvious move would be for the European Central Bank to assign what's known as a risk weight to treasuries. This would basically make treasuries less attractive to banks, which are legally required to hold a certain amount of risk-free assets. The third is a regulatory fiddle to make American stocks less attractive. Europeans love buying American stocks, and for good reason. The main American stock index, the S&P 500, has performed remarkably well over the past few decades. However, European governments could tempt European money away from US stocks into European ones by offering, say, preferential tax treatment for investors who invest in Europe. This might sound a bit heavy-handed, but it's an idea that European politicians are becoming increasingly interested in. In the UK, for instance, Chancellor Rachel Reeves was apparently considering something called a Brit ISA, which would have offered tax perks to Brits who invested in UK stocks. It's also worth noting that lots of countries already use tax perks to make their bonds more attractive. In the US, for instance, interest on treasuries is exempt from state taxes. So doing something similar to make your stock market more attractive doesn't feel like too much of a leap. This could be a particularly effective way of exercising leverage over Trump at the moment, given the US stock market is currently looking pretty bubbly, and a substantial redirection of European funds from America into European stocks could be the prick that pops it. This would be terrible news for the US economy, given how much it currently relies on wealthy Americans, but with less risk of spillover into Europe or systemic dysfunction in transatlantic financial markets. Now, you're probably looking to follow this story as it develops, but how are you supposed to keep track of which outlets online are actually trustworthy, and which are just fabricating a false narrative for you to follow? Well, that's where our sponsor this week, Ground News, comes in. That's because Ground News is a website and app that helps you make sense of the complex and ever-changing media landscape. It can get increasingly overwhelming, with thousands of articles being thrown at us every day. But Ground News puts all of those articles into one place, helping you fully understand the story from start to finish. Each article even comes with a breakdown into bias distribution, factuality, and ownership of each individual source. For instance, if we take this story on Besant's recent comments, we can see that there are 72 sources currently reporting on it, with most of the coverage coming from the right. We can even dive into how each side is reporting by using their bias comparison feature, showing us that the left is focusing more on Trump's push to acquire Greenland, describing it as an aggressive push or annexation, while the right is emphasising European weakness. Our absolute favourite feature, though, is their blind spot feed. Here you can see all the stories you might not have seen on your feed. So even if you don't agree with the reporting, it's good to know what's being left out of your bubble. You're probably used to being fed the news that the algorithm has decided is best for you, and breaking out of that spiral is harder than ever. Ground News will do that for you, freeing you from algorithmic restraints and letting you think freely again. So, if you want to start questioning the narrative instead of just consuming it, you can join Ground News today, and using our link will get you 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. All you have to do is subscribe through the link in the description. Go to ground.news/TLDR or scan the QR code on screen, and you'll be supporting an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.